do we have any written questions that anyone wants to? Yeah.
Yeah, hand's been up for a while.
My question is that you have been talking about little people.
Yes, we have.
I have gray hair. And one of the things that I have been recently interested is in the brain balance program that we have here in town. And the reason is because I have an autistic cousin in Ireland, and I have a cousin who's been called weird by her peers in Youngstown. So as a nurse, I came into this Discoverers group as part of a person who did not know anything about the Natural History Museum or anything of that area. So part for me is then how I have decided to become a curious person anyway. I have always been. I've always wanted to know what's going on out there. And so how do I then apply it? By reading and using it in many contexts. Right now, I do the breakfast bar at a hotel. But I have an ability that somebody said, I can't teach what you do. And it's because I can take any person and they can give me a cue and I can answer their question or go to where their need is. But that was part of my training as a nurse. Now, what does that mean for little children? Or what does it mean for the adult? I was happy to learn in the brain balance program that both the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere don't always grow at the same rate. Just like you watch kids. Now, I'm an adult nurse, so anybody under 3 feet tall, I didn't know what to do with most of the time. So for me, it's been happy to look at what Jose does here for our reptiles and snakes, and is going to do an exhibition that we hope to have a new Discoverers animal, or whatever we call those people those little critters down there that I don't know about, after our group. But it's what do we do with that? How can we make that fun? How can we even make it into a children's story that we have here? Because we inherited an animal that was endangered, and it came to us through California, and we need a children's book written about it. So for me, what you're only talking about little people. There's us up here who have gray hair.
I can address that. My goal in life has been to have the curiosity and joy of a 10-year-old with the competency of an adult. And I think that as teachers at universities, as people at museums, part of our job is for those people who haven't found a way to do that, to model for them. To model for those kids what it's like to be an adult who is curious and explores, and how that can bring you joy, and how the work that you do, the serious work that you do, can be about curiosity and joy and fun as much as it's about the serious issues that you pursue. And I think if we do that effectively, we will attract kids to STEM, to STEAM, and provide a lot of joy for kids at the same time.
Your point is well taken. We do actually have those of us who teach, at Pitt, we do actually teach some gray-haired people. Some of us have gray hair. And I have a 69-year-old PhD student, for example, who's very curious. But I think you raised the larger issue in a way of the multiplicity and diversity of our audiences. And this is, clearly this is a very, very, very important issue for museums, but it's also an important issue for universities, and looking at diversity in a lot of different ways across age and race and class and all the other ways.
And the way brains are structured.
And
right?
yes, and the diversity. So I have a 20-year-old autistic daughter, and she is profoundly curious about certain things, right, and totally not about most things that most of the rest of the world is curious about. She's not, and then she's curious about things that most of the rest of us have. We're not even sure what's sparking the curiosity, but it's profoundly interesting, and those kinds of, I think, also people we call disabilities, people with disabilities or so on, I think really need to be included in this conversation and I think sites are very important for them, as well.
Yeah,
and
we were
the-
talking about access,
Yes,
right, earlier,
right.
and privilege, and who are the sites for, who are the owners, so to speak, of the sites, and who are the visitors to the sites, and what are we assuming about them. I think that can go in a lot of directions. Yes, we have a question over here.
Hi. Sorry, I'm over here.
Oh, you're over here. Okay.
Hiding. My question is really related to what you were just speaking about, Kate. I think what's really interesting is we've talked about these sort of rarefied places as being places that evoke curiosity, laboratories, museums, studios, spaces and places that people don't often have access to in your day-to-day life when you work at, say, a bank or something like that. What can the spaces that people exist in most of the time take away from these types of places to evoke curiosity and sort of like the day-to-day wonder of life?
Mud puddles were mentioned earlier.
I can give you about a dozen monuments within a block of here to look at.
I think looking at the plants growing up out of the cracks in the concrete provokes questions, I mean, this stuff is all around us, and we walk by it every day. And so again, sort of modeling, looking at where you are and looking critically and curiously at where you are. It's there. You don't, I hate to say this, but you don't have to come to a museum to do it.
I
Can we
just
quote
want
you?
to I just want to share one anecdote because this was something that Kate and I were talking about. Kate began this discussion with, well, is that a artistic? Is her daughter's being kind of thought of as artistic and scientific at the same time by different people? But I remember when I was a kid, I would go to summer courses at the Museum of Science and Industry, it was called, in Los Angeles. Wonderful museum. And one assignment, and I still remember this assignment so vividly. The assignment that the instructor gave us, and I was 8 years old, was to go into our backyard and to mark off a square foot with stakes and string of the backyard, and then to look and describe everything that we could see in that square foot of yard. And I couldn't believe it, how much there was in there. It was just like a revelation. It was like a little universe in this little bit of grass. And so obviously, for some reason, I'm very interested in ordinary, neglected places that people don't pay any attention to. But I think we certainly don't have to come to a museum to have that experience. And it's something like, it's a really gifted teacher like that who set up this incredible assignment, that changed the way I thought about yards for the rest of my life,
And depending on what kind of kid you are, that could change your path toward science, toward art, toward all kinds of things if you're given the opportunity to explore and find out who you are.
And also, when we were talking about institutions, and we were talking before this about, excuse me, who has access, and I was thinking, so we were talking about museums and universities, and the spaces that right now are being talked about in terms of how they are rarefied. We didn't talk about libraries, which, are still, I think even though they're embattled, are still like our great public spaces and sites that a lot of people have access to in a lot of neighborhoods. And, where I think for a lot of people, that's where they get to exercise their curiosity and, read literature, which certainly sparks. So I was thinking it was funny that with you leaving this, we didn't even talk about libraries.
We didn't get to libraries. Yeah, but we're there now. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and the public library system is amazing with all their programs for adults and children.
And just as, how about browsing in the stacks and stumbling before there was stumble upon, real stumble upon.
Real stumbling. Yeah, definitely.
You just used the word exercising curiosity because it is something that needs to be exercised. It's a habit that you have to do over and over again and get better at it and learn that its rewards may be infrequent, but they arrive over time. But it requires like kind of your attention has to be open, more open than the normal expectation is. And unfortunately, we tend to fill that space where our attention could be open with our cell phones. Those are the moments in which you're checking your Facebook or whatever. You're on a bus, you're waiting for somebody. These are kind of the incredible moments where you have the opportunity to actually pay attention to all the stuff that you're not being asked to pay attention to. And that's something you can train, is to look to the periphery, look at the things that you're not supposed to be looking at, and you just practice that over and over again. This is what I do with my art students, just forcing them to really ignore everything that you think is, ignore that, and then look at everything else. And that's where the good stuff is, because nobody has seen it. This is where all the gems are that are hiding in plain sight. But it takes practice. But that's something that you can take with you everywhere you go, right? It doesn't happen in museums. If you practice it in a museum, it's very interesting, because all these exhibits that everybody spends so much money on, and then you pay attention to the other stuff, also interesting.
Definitely. I think we have a question from Nate.
Yeah, so this is a perfect segue. So you've spoken a lot about cultivating curiosity in others, and clearly that comes from your experience working with others, working with children, working with students. But you're also professionally curious in your own lives. And as Rich was just saying, curiosity is a skill that you develop. It's particularly something you need to take on as a personal responsibility as an adult. And so I want to turn this on you and say, how do you stimulate and practice your own curiosity using sights, using openness, using mindfulness in your environments? How have you learned to be more curious over the course of your own personal lives?
Who wants to take that first? I vote for Barbara.
I think I'm going to start, first of all, I want to start calling myself professionally curious.
Yeah, I like that.
Personally curious. So, I mean, that's, I could go back to the first thing I was saying, which is sort of trying to put myself in studio situations or situations where I'm making work where there's something new about the situation. So there's something that I have to discover. And I think, so it's about paying attention, which is sort of what you're talking about as well. And when you were talking about noticing the things on the periphery, I thought, or you're looking at something, just turn to one side, and now that's on the periphery, and so now you can really see what it is. So, I think when I'm working in the studio, the thing that I worry about is becoming very programmatic. I want everything to be, I want there to be discovery for me, which I think carries in the work for others when they see it. And so, it's like these tricks to keep yourself in a position where you don't know things. Kind of, it's what we were talking about with students, where there's something there for you to work with, but always trying to find ways so that you're sort of not in your comfortable, I know what this is, I've looked at this 1,000, so that you are sort of noticing all those things on the periphery.
So in science, the experiments that we do where we expect a particular outcome and we get that outcome are easily publishable, but they're not the things you learn from. It's the experiments that don't go the way you planned, even though you did the experiment correctly, that you learn from. It's the unexpected that challenges you to, it challenges your understanding of the world. So I think that's a critically important part of making progress in your understanding of the world. The other part that's really important in science is that we think of science as this completely rational process. And we have this kind of rational pasta maker that turns out knowledge. We do this Popperian hypothetico-deductive method, and out comes information, right? Out comes affirmation of our theories. But the question is where those theories come from. A theory is a rational explication of an idea. What is an idea? It's outside that rational framework, right? And so there's this whole sea of human thought which is not rational. It's not irrational, it's not rational. And the creativity And the breakthroughs in science depend on your ability to do unsupervised thinking, to let your thoughts go where they want to go. And then once they get there, you figure out what that's telling you in a rational framework. And that takes some real practicing to do.
Yeah, and for me, a lot of this is a physical process. Again, when I was happy that Kate asked me to be on the sites panel because, so for me, the physical process of encountering something interesting in an environment and then looking at it, analyzing it, changes depending on whether I'm approaching it on foot or on bike or by car, or the speed at which I'm going through the landscape. And I'm finding out increasingly that I'm very, very aware of how slowing down and coming back and repeating over and over again the experience of looking at the same thing, I've been working on a project that involves the Soldier Cemetery at Allegheny, the Soldier Lot in Allegheny Cemetery. And I'm just amazed that I keep coming back, and every time I come back, there's something, I can't believe that I overlooked this really fundamental, I make some new discovery when I go there. Or even if I'm reading a document, if I have to do a lot of work that involves reading handwritten 19th century documents. And there's something about actually sitting down and transcribing the document and actually writing down. I've already read it. I've read it. I've read every word in it. But then when I transcribe it and write it down, I learn new things. Why is that? It's really mysterious.
I think
right?
physical movement is thought.
It's physical movement is thought. And so it's the same thing with sites and moving through. So often, like again, if we get back to students want a method of looking. They want to say, well, so what is your method of visual analysis? Well, and I would say, well, I don't know that I really have a method of visual analysis. I look for certain things, but then, it's when that method breaks down that things are interesting, and I have to keep coming back and learn something new. My method hopefully changes because I've encountered a new object that didn't fit the prior method. But I can only do that it takes time, and it takes the physical act of actually going through the site over and over and over again. Which is a kind of discipline. It's a kind of discipline and also kind of patience. And
I have a question for Rich.
I wanted to talk about storytelling just briefly because I think that's a big part of my process is I'm constantly telling stories about things, and then through doing that I notice things about them or notice gaps in the narrative, and I go back looking for more. But I'm also looking for things to tell me stories. I'm seeing the history embedded in a material. A school desk that has a lot of writing carved in it becomes a really interesting document of kind of what's happened in that place. I'm just kind of always looking for that stuff. I remember once having an old book that was belonged to my great-grandmother, and I noticed there was these impressions in it. And so I took my pencil and I just kind of ran it across it, just kind of intuitively. I don't know why the heck I was doing this. But there was a drawing in there. It was an impression from somebody drawing on top of the book, and it was a picture of a child's drawing of a farmhouse, and it was like this very immediate, direct connection to a person, maybe in my family. But you only see that through paying attention to stuff that you're not supposed to be looking at the creases in the paper when you're reading a book, right? But looking for those stories. There was.
It's a question for you and a parallel question for everyone else. You were talking about the difference between curiosity and wonder, and as you were doing that, I kept thinking about the word Wunderkammer, which in English translates to a cabinet of curiosities, and you have so clearly outlined the difference between the two, but also kind of a fulcrum where it goes from wonder to curiosity. And since you run this place called Center for PostNatural History, I am interested in hearing you talk about this shift from wonder and curiosity. And if you have in your quick research on those two words come across when that etymological split or the translational shift occurred, if there is something in that gap that kind of sheds light on how we go from just a sense of wonder to a curiosity that takes us to the place behind the curtain.
Sure. I'm not not a real historian of Wunderkammers, but I do see a shift happening over time where people with these collections are kind of participating in an economy of wonder that had existed pretty much exclusively in the church. Reliquaries, this sort of thing. You travel a great distance to see something wonderful, astounding, a piece of a saint, or maybe a piece of the cross itself, and it was in a place that was incredibly beautiful. And there to inspire wonder. And people were applying that methodology to other things that they had brought from a very far away place. These were expensive to acquire. People would also travel great distances and even maybe pay money to see them, but they were serving a different end. And in the beginning, you might think of like Linnaeus. He was collecting specimens from all over the place and trying to bring them together in these amazing cabinets of curiosity. And he had kind of a scientific mandate, and it was in his case, it was to share God's wonders. And if we if we go forward about 150 years or so, you have the first natural history museums, and they're still kind of referring to this religious sense of wonder in their architecture. But it's this kind of slow transition into it, not being about necessarily celebrating the wonders of God, but we're looking at a different kind of a history of provenance for these objects. The Natural History Museum in London, I think, is a really excellent example of that, because it was sort of built right in the moment before Darwin drops. And then it's all read differently by people. What is unfortunate, I think, is that after that moment, we start to separate out these collections and our way of looking at them. We separate out the rational from the non-rational. And we have the Art Museum over there, and the Natural History Museum over here, and we are in this strange hybrid chimera right now. There's no other place I know of in the world quite like what we have here at the Carnegie. Where it's the bicameral mind. They are present, but
But not necessarily talking to each other.
Exactly. And it is within that space that I find myself, that I found the need to create this museum that was ultimately about nature and culture and where they kind of overlap. The parts that kind of get excluded from either part of that conversation. And it's the stuff that, if you go back 200 years, would have obviously been in a Wunderkammer. Most of our exhibits would not have been excluded. They would have been front and center. This is interesting stuff. But as we kind of separate out the nature and the culture and the aesthetically beautiful from the intellectually provocative, we kind of lose that.
So I think I'll toss out another question that I mentioned to these folks beforehand, but it seems like a good time for it. And I'm curious about what you think about the idea of control, especially since we've been talking about institutions and things inside institutions and outside institutions, 19th century institutions, really, in a lot of ways. And how exerting control contributes to cultivating curiosity, and how relinquishing control can also contribute. I heard that in what you were just saying, Rich, quite a bit.
Relinquishing control, yeah. The term like cognitive autonomy popped into my head when we were talking about this stuff. Like, you have to be free to think about it in your own way. And that's also something that, like, particularly with the science museums, we don't want people to arrive at the wrong conclusion, so we're going to kind of parcel out the knowledge in very, very specific pieces. Whereas there's kind of an infinitude of conclusions that could be drawn, and it's how do you navigate that? When you listen to the kinds of questions that kids ask when they're standing in front of the dioramas, you become instantly aware of that. At least when they come into our museum, they want to know, like, is that dead? Or is that alive? And it's like, clearly not. But, you know, like they're trying to wrap their head around what it is that they're being confronted with. Is it real? Another really common question. Wow, where to begin with that? But these are fantastic places to start, you know, a dialogue. Did you kill it? Also really good ones, you know. What was its name? Really hard to answer these questions, you know. But they're fantastic.
I got that question, by the way, in front of taxidermy. My daughter and her friends said, "Is it real?" And we talked about, you know, what is real. And they were not satisfied with any of my answers.
Good.
Yeah, I'll take them to you.
I think this notion of relinquishing control is a really important one. In my lab, that became a really important and sort of delicate thing, but the success in the lab depended on my giving over control to the people in the lab, which does not mean sort of ignoring and letting them go. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but it has to be a sort of a democracy in a way for the whole thing to work. They have to have a level of autonomy, a level of power, which also, what comes with it is a level of responsibility. And by giving them the power, they also assume the responsibility for paying attention to what they're doing, and having to sort of self-monitor, and having to jointly problem solve as well. And by doing that, one of the former students in my lab is here, Kira. She's actually in Nate's lab now, so she might laugh at some of this. But I found that when I was giving instructions, oftentimes, I'd be saying, be careful to do this and not to do this and that sort of thing. And what they were hearing was, don't screw up. And that's basically all they were hearing. And I think instead, they have to become empowered parts of the process. And once you do that, so that they're no longer afraid to tell you when things are going right and when they're going in unexpected ways, you now get information that is critical to the success of what you're doing. And that means allowing them, in fact, charging them with the responsibility to be curious about what they're seeing and to talk about it, and to be okay with the fact that they're observing the whole thing crashing down sometimes, you know.
Barbara, it strikes me that the studio classroom is another place where, you know, you're dealing with control and lack of control and how much autonomy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like trying to find that sweet spot where you're giving a few parameters, but not over-determining what the responses are going to be. Because, you know, you're always saying, there is not one way to do this. There is not an answer here.
Right.
You know, this is like, you know, I sometimes say this is like a collaboration. This is,
Right.
you know, here's some starter dough. Do something.
Right, but you also want to tell them, don't touch the stove, you'll burn yourself.
Right, exactly.
Right?
No, exactly. But this doesn't have to do with teaching studio classes, but I mean, I think, you know, an obvious thing is with art museums, and I guess any museums, curating is a big kind of control because you're getting at this, you know, it tells a particular story, there's a narrative, who's being shown, you know, when are they being, you know, like, there's a lot that determines what the audience is going to be curious about, what kind of questions the audience is going to ask in that. And when you were talking a little bit in the beginning, I was wondering, you know, how much, I'm sure there are many ways that the audience or audiences to museums are shaping, it's got to be some kind of like responsive feedback loop, are shaping the way, you know, curators are putting things together.
I don't know that that's true, but it ought to be true. And one of the things that we need to learn how to do is to make the visitors participants in the design, right? And by doing that, we also then can be more inclusive about who feels comfortable in the museum. It's so interesting to watch people come into the museum. And some people feel entitled and perfectly comfortable. Other people walk in and it's clear they are thinking, I don't know the rules here. And so making them participants in a way which is simply listening and paying attention to how they're reacting to what they see and what questions it's provoking for them, and making sure that you incorporate those so that what you have in the museum is a dynamic thing which is responsive to the audiences. That's the ultimate goal, I think.
We have a question. Yes.
I have a pretty loud voice. As much as we want our kids, all of us, to be curious, doesn't our society innately put a squelch on that? I'm sure I could say to you, who was the teacher that influenced you? Who was the employer that gave you the time and money to do that sort of thing? We have an awful lot of square pegs that can do wonderful things, but we have more round holes that society pushes us into, that the kid who doesn't want to get on the bus from the expedition because they're so taken with some little piece of thing. And you're saying, okay, Zelda, let's get on the bus. We got to get back to this thing. It squelches that curiosity. The person who works for the bank, okay, who maybe wants to come up with a better way of counting the money or whatever, but we don't have time for that, okay? I think we were all sort of lucky. I know I was very lucky, one, to have a group of teachers along in grade school and in high school and in college who allowed me to be different, allowed me to ask questions. I had a wonderful chairman of the Department of Pediatrics who hired me to do academic medicine, which I never wanted to do, and I said, I don't want to do this. And if I join you, what can I do? And he said, you want to do something with that poison center? Go do it. And he covered my back and front from those people that said, Moriarty's crazy. Okay, we don't have time for that kind of crap. Okay. And then I found a benefactor who's willing to invest money in that kind of crap. And so it's very tough. I can understand where you guys are coming from, but boy, we're fighting sort of an uphill battle all the time.
We have a follow-up question here, if
Well,
you don't
I
mind.
think to dovetail on what Richard's saying, because
Can you speak into the mic?
in the microphone,
Thanks.
speak into the microphone. One of the words that I was thinking of, is sort of floating through my head when you're talking about control, was the word defiance, and what's the relationship between kind of curiosity and defiance? Is that you have to buck the system, you have to listen to the voice in your head, and the idea of traveling, and that you're free of these rules when you're traveling. You're out of your realm, you're out of all of those usual things, and you just can think something new, and or you have to work hard at it on the other end of the spectrum, and you have to be defiant almost to be curious. And I wondered if any of you could comment on that part of it, and especially, from very young to older, the spectrum.
This is a really nice thread that we are picking up now from our first curiosity discussion from a few weeks ago, where Paulo Palmieri was talking about heresy in relationship to curiosity. But we actually are sort of getting close to the end, so maybe you could each respond and say any final words that you want to say. In any order.
I think a few people have alluded to like their own experience. Like you had that teacher, whoever it was, it created a space for you, and kind of our job is to pass it on using all the resources we have. And part of that is with your attention, because that costs nothing, but is your time. And that means talking to people who are talking and interested in things that make no sense to you, right? Because you're not curious about it, but this is how we pass it on, you know. You help out. If they, you know, need a ride to pick up some stuff and it's heavy, and why are you keeping all this crap, or whatever it is, that's how we pass it on. So that's all I got.
And we defend people when their curiosity bumps up against the system. The system is utterly dependent on curiosity for its evolution. Evolution is a really interesting example of that. The huge diversity and wonder of life on Earth depends on this precarious balance between deterministic forces and these creative stochastic forces that bump life in new directions. Often those new directions fall over, but often enough they lead to new life forms that have populated the planet. In the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, when the giant meteor smashed into the earth around the Yucatan Peninsula, it knocked out 3/4 of the species on the earth. And the earth is populated with this amazing, wondrous diversity because of these crazy disruptions of the deterministic process. And curiosity plays that same role in the evolution of our culture. It disrupts the normal process. And what we need to do is find a way to incorporate that in a way that's as harmonious as possible, and accept it as an important way in which we gain new understanding and evolve our culture in harmonious ways.
Practice, practice, practice.
And I guess I would just add to that, if we as museums and universities don't do it, then, I mean, who is going to do it? I mean, we have to do this. It's our responsibility to cultivate curiosity and to engage with communities that have not been encouraged to be curious, and to try to foster curiosity, not just among the privileged, you know, but especially among the underprivileged.
Yeah.
Especially among those people who have curiosity beaten out of them, you know. And so I just feel like that must be what we do. It must, and as our higher education and museums evolve in this changing climate, I think if we don't do it, we probably aren't going to survive, actually. I think we're going to, on the evolutionary ladder, we're going to disappear. So.
And I just want to also to like acknowledge all the places where curiosity is happening outside of these. I mean, I completely agree with that, but to not sort of, you know, to give due to all the places that people are being extremely curious outside of all these institutions.
Well, thank you,
I'm sorry, yes,
everyone.
go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for your time this evening, to our speakers, for everyone who's joined us in the audience. We have the discoverers, we have all of the other people from Pitt and CMU and all over town. So we're very happy that we could all come together and talk about curiosity.